Hello and welcome back. Thank you all for joining us. Those who are able to join for this part two. I know it's late after a fun filled, probably mildly exhausting holiday, but I appreciate you all joining me. We'll get started now. Hello and welcome back to those of you who are able to join us for this second part. In part one, we looked at the different types of political alliances, the demographic segments of the colonists, and ended with what motivated each segment to fight either with the radical patriots for independence or with the conservative loyalists to remain under Britain. The American Indians, whether they were patriots or loyalists, were both conservatives because they fought to conserve different aspects of their societies. The American Indian patriots fought to conserve their military and trade alliances that they had established with the colonists. The American Indian loyalists fought to conserve their social and political independence, to safeguard the control of their lands, and to preserve their traditional ways of life. For the enslaved Africans, if they were involved at all, they were loyalist, which for them was radical because they wanted the immediate and drastic change from the literal pain and abuse of slavery to complete self-determination. So, of course, we know how the story of the revolution ends. The Patriot Alliance prevailed. The colonies became independent, the Union of States emerged, and the hodgepodge of all those competing factions, who would come ultimately to be called Americans, were left to their own devices, all except the African loyalists, who left with the British, many of whom ultimately returned to Africa, getting arguably the best deal of them all. This is probably a good time to point out people speak of the American dream as if there is only one and everyone wants the same thing. And that has never, at any point in the USA's history, been the case. Land and the opportunity to build wealth may have been the original drawing card, but now as then, sorry about that, but now as then, the people's experience of what they are experiencing now, their actual experience versus their different desired experience, is what is the determining factor as far as the opportunity that they see in this country. And we can see this looking at the different motivations for the various segments of colonial society to fight not just for independence, but to implement their vision for the new nation. So, during the revolution, the colonies had organized themselves under the Articles of Confederation into a perpetual union of autonomous states, a structure which is similar to the European Union. The Articles also established a Confederation Congress as the governing body. There are two characteristics of this Congress that are worth noting. The first is that it was broke. It had no viable revenue stream, no authority to create one, so it was destined to stay broke. Secondly, it was impotent. It had no power over the states, despite their perpetual union, which, by the way, would come back to haunt them. The states retained their autonomy. So each state's constitution, legislature, and governor were the supreme governing authorities within its borders. Like the Articles, most of the state constitutions had been written during the Revolution. The Union of States had announced their independence with the declaration that all men are created equal. But no state constitution actually committed itself to that ideal. So it wasn't legally binding. The state constitutions reflected the political philosophy of whichever of the state's ruling elite faction happened to have been in power at that time. Some firmly embraced democracy, but others were quite paternalistic, and all of them enshrined legal discriminations that marginalized women, Africans, American Indians, and even Catholics. These marginalized populations got no representation in their state governments, and in fact, needed protection from their state governments, which, of course, the articles didn't offer. Nonetheless, the Confederation Congress was considered to be a representative government, and it was to a point. It was designed to represent the states of the Union, not the people of the states. In drafting the articles and creating the Congress, the ruling elite maintained the perception that as representatives of the people, they were the people and had the right to impose on their constituents for their own personal gain. Now, aside from being weak, broke, and not truly representative, the Articles of Confederation had other problems. Politically, the Confederation Congress was so weak, states and delegates didn't even take it seriously. It hardly ever had a quorum, and when it did, they rarely accomplished anything. The biggest issue was that to change any aspect of the articles, the vote had to be unanimous, meaning all the states had to agree, which made the document too rigid and unwieldy to work effectively. It had economic problems. The states had trade issues among them that the articles simply didn't have the authority to remedy. For example, states could impose duties on each other, but Congress couldn't act on behalf of the Union to impose duties on other countries. A vulnerability Britain was taking full advantage of to economically bully its former little brother. Then it had social issues. So technically, the Union government didn't represent any individuals, only the states. But the ruling elite identified their interests with those of the states. So they considered themselves to be represented. And the women of the day mostly saw their interests as being tied to those of their men. But those landless, have not white men and so called free Africans, some of whom had even fought for independence, were still oppressed, still suffering legal discrimination, still had no voting rights and no way to control their destinies, and in the case of the Africans, still lived under the looming threat of slavery, some with family members still suffering in bondage. These men, Black and white, didn't have the freedom they had fought for, and many were willing to keep on fighting until they did have it. Not to mention the enslaved people who were constantly staging rebellions to liberate themselves from the depraved and immoral condition they were legally forced to endure. For the ruling elites, no Britain meant no royal army to provide protection should any or all of these disaffected groups choose to strike a blow against the life, limb, or property of their oppressors, who were, you guessed it, the ruling elite, some of whom were becoming very uncomfortable. They were frustrated with the weak, ineffective Union government. Their money was funny because of the trade situation, and the natives were getting restless, in a manner of speaking. In other words, the survival of the ruling elite was being threatened with no available remedy to alleviate their pain. Something had to change. Radical action was bound to follow. So remember when I said that slavery was like a presence in the colonies? Well, here is where it makes its presence known. Slavery was still legal everywhere throughout the Union. I mean, Georgia had long since eliminated its ban. And by that time, it was among the places where slavery was the most brutal. But some states had begun to wean their economies from a total dependence on slavery with gradual abolition. And the very existence of slave states weakened the institution because they provided the possibility of safe havens for people who chose to free themselves. Then, too, times were changing. I mean, scrutiny of slavery was growing worldwide. The founding fathers had always been concerned about appearances, how they were perceived by their equals around the world. But they were extra sensitive to the contrast between the lofty ideals they laid out in the Declaration of Independence for their own freedom versus the horrors and barbarism, not to mention deprivation of freedom, that they themselves inflicted on the victims of slavery and human trafficking. So, this was the backdrop against which the ruling elites, terrified of rebellion by the have not free men, or God forbid, the enslaved people, proposed the radical idea for a new constitution. But their agenda faced some major hurdles. The first disadvantage was that no one asked for change. They didn't have a mandate for it. The articles required approval from all the states to make any change, not to mention one as drastic as creating a whole new government. But the constitutionalists, radicalized by their discomfort, didn't have time for all that. The threat they perceived to their survival took precedence over whatever the process may have been. Then there was the distrust factor. Trust was already always in short supply among the ruling elite. But the covert nature of the Constitutional Convention sowed even more seeds of distrust among convention delegates. They had questionable authority, which led them to clandestine measures. The process of drafting the Constitution was held in strictest secret. In service to this secrecy, the windows of their meeting room were nailed shut in the middle of summer with no air conditioning. Yeah. Then there was desperation. History praises the spirit of compromise that drove the constitutional debates, but that spirit was born of desperation. Radicalized by the discomfort of their fear and insecurity, the constitutionalists were vulnerable and desperate to alleviate their pain. They wouldn't be able to hold out for the best terms. They had to get the deal done at any cost, and it would be costly. The compromises they were forced to make to resolve the most contentious issues, balance of power and protections for slavery, were the primary causes of the Civil War. So, balance of power refers to equal voting power for all the states. And the articles provided for perfect balance because no matter how many delegates each state had, they had to vote together as one. This was a major sore spot for large states. They wanted to benefit from their larger populations with more votes. But small states pushed back against population-based representation. They feared being dominated by the larger states. And states where a high percentage of the population was enslaved didn't like the idea either, because enslaved people couldn't vote. So by right, they shouldn't be counted, meaning those states would get fewer delegates. But fewer delegates meant less power, and that wouldn't do. States where the economy revolved around slavery wanted their non-voting, legal non-persons to be counted as people so the state would have more voting power. This one required two solutions. The first was the two-chamber legislature, the upper chamber Senate with equal representation for all the states, and a lower chamber House where representation was apportioned by population. The second solution was the 3/5 compromise, which allowed 3/5 of a state's enslaved population to be counted in calculating the number of House representatives the state could have. Then there was slavery. So, as an indication of just how much the social climate had shifted with regard to slavery, in drafting the Articles of Confederation, there's no evidence that slavery even came up as an issue. 9 years later, in drafting the Constitution, it was not only an issue, but a point of contention that deadlocked negotiations and threatened to derail the whole effort. South Carolina and Georgia even threatened to walk out. States that were less dependent on slavery were more concerned about the international scrutiny that they would endure, and they pushed to marginalize slavery. But states where slavery drove not only the economy, but also defined the social order, saw any limitation on slavery as a threat to their survival, and they fought to preserve it and demanded protections for it. This one, too, required two solutions. The first was a delayed ban on human trafficking for 10 years until 1808. The second solution was the inclusion of the so called Fugitive Slave Clause, the provision in Article 4, Section 2, that declared a quote, person held to service or labor, end quote, meaning enslaved, in any state could not attain freedom merely by escaping into a state where slavery was illegal, and required all states to deliver up such person on demand. Then there was the supremacy of the Constitution. So get this, the states were finally free with supreme authority within their borders. Then along come the constitutionalists with their rogue document to replace the Articles of Confederation without the required agreement of all the states. Replace the Confederation Congress with not just a new government, but a whole new government structure. And then, oh, by the way, you remember how the king and parliament used to be able to overrule us? Well, now our new constitution can do that. Yep, precisely what they had just fought 8 long years to break free from. The radical constitutionalists didn't imagine they could ever get the states to approve. And if the states didn't submit to their new constitution, all those hot, sweaty days in Philadelphia spent hammering out compromises would have been for naught. But how could the Constitution gain legitimacy if not from the states? Why, from the people, of course, the real people. So again, we know how this story ends. The constitutionalists prevailed. Their document was ratified, the new government was established, and the Constitution remains the law of the land to this very day. But even after a civil war and more than 235 years, the issue of states' rights, federal authority versus state authority, is every bit as contentious today as it ever was. Now that we understand political alliances, who forms them and why, let's look at some of these early conflicts that still drive politics today, starting with states' rights. So the Civil War was fought between the Union, who wanted to preserve the perpetual Union, versus the Confederate States, who wanted to preserve balance of power. Interestingly, the language of perpetual union didn't carry over from the Articles. In their desperation, the radical constitutionalists omitted that declaration. Mentioned 3 times in the Articles, perpetual union isn't mentioned even once in the Constitution. So technically, there was no reason why the states didn't have the right to secede. But the ruling elite in Union states perceived the expansion of slavery and the dissolution of the Union as threats to their security. hence the radical alliance that ultimately became the Republican Party and the subsequent election of Lincoln without a single vote from slave states. Fast forward to 2024, when the argument over whether the proper authority to legalize abortion lies with state governments or the federal government. Stolen election. So Andrew Jackson, who was the nation's seventh president, was a common man's man. He appealed to that segment of the electorate that felt disempowered, saw their needs as being ignored or underserved. The first time he ran was in 1824, and in that election there were three other contenders, so a total of four people running for president. Jackson got more popular votes than anybody else. He got more electoral college votes than the other three. But nobody, including Jackson, got a majority of the electoral college votes, meaning more than 50%. And in that case, the Constitution stipulates that the election is decided in the House of Representatives. But the House can only choose from the top three vote getters. So the fourth guy was just out. As it turned out, the fourth guy was a member of the House. He was a House representative, and he hated Jackson. He felt like he was beneath the office of president. He just hated the guy. So he orchestrated a deal whereby he would throw support behind one of the other three candidates or one of the other two candidates in exchange for a nice cushy position in the administration. Jackson was livid. He hit the ceiling. He spent the next 4 years railing against the stolen election and corruption in the government and vowing to run again, which he indeed did. And his 1828 campaign was the foundation on which the Democratic Party was built. Fast forward to 2020, to Donald Trump's stolen election and his MAGA movement, which appeals to the same disaffected element as Jackson. Unfortunately, their victim mentality makes them vulnerable to exploitation by anybody promising to elevate their cause. Political violence. Before the Civil War, slavery defined everything: home, religion, politics, and everything in between. In 1856, 5 years before the Civil War, a South Carolina House representative who was a slaveholder walked into the Senate chamber and beat a Massachusetts senator who was an abolitionist nearly to death with the metal end of his cane. Then calmly walked away, leaving a pool of blood on the Senate floor. Fast forward to 2021, January 6th, when a violent mob attacks the nation's capital, brandishing a noose and calling for the heads of House Speaker and the Vice President. Immigration. So before the Civil War, the issue of immigration centered around the tide of legal immigrants that the ruling elites were bringing in to keep worker wages low, and the quote-unquote Indian problem in undeveloped territories in the West. Today, the issue of immigration centers around illegal immigrants and border security at the South. You know, it's interesting. During the Constitutional Convention, one of the delegates prophetically commented that he doubted the Union would even survive 150 years. And in fact, it was in less than half that time that the Civil War broke out. Here we are, 600,000 lost souls, 30 presidents, and more than 160 years. Here we are in 2024. The political landscape looks eerily similar to 1860, which begs the question, are we headed for round two? Thank you so much to everyone who was able to tune in to both parts. And for those of you who were not, of course, they are recorded. You can watch them anytime. Thank you so much for your support and have a wonderful evening.